Before my DJI Osmo 360 even arrived, I was deep into reviews of the camera and especially comparisons with the Insta360 X5. Most of them made them out to be pretty close in terms of image quality, maybe with just some small differences in color science or overall vibe. So when mine finally showed up, I went into testing expecting things to be very close. But after just a couple of days, I'm surprised by how big some of the differences actually are. And the 4 areas where I think the DJI Osmo 360 clearly pulls ahead of the Insta360 X5 are as follows: better high dynamic range, more natural image quality with less reliance on AI processing, less lens flare, and smooth slow motion thanks to 8K 50fps recording. But stick around to the very end because I also ran into one major image quality issue with the Osmo 360, and unless DJI can somehow fix this, it could outweigh all those other wins and make it hard to recommend over the Insta360 X5 on image quality alone. Let's start with HDR performance because the difference here is pretty huge. When I first got my Insta360 X5, I noticed the limitations in dynamic range immediately. In scenes with strong contrast, like bright skies and dark foregrounds, the sky often ended up being completely blown out. Now this isn't really surprising because HDR is especially tricky for 360 cameras. Instead of just capturing a single frame shot, they have to process an entire sphere of video, and with dual sensors working together, the computational load for HDR is a lot heavier. That's why I was genuinely impressed with how much better the DJI Osmo 360 handles HDR scenes. Just take a look at these side-by-side shots. You can clearly see how much more highlight detail the Osmo 360 preserves compared to the X5. Let's discuss one specific example. In this scene, I was able to bring back the blue sky and cloud detail on the Insta360 X5, but only by cranking the EV all the way down to -3.7. The problem, everything else in the shot ends up way too dark. With the Osmo 360, I didn't have to make that trade-off. I got to keep the detail in the sky and still maintain proper exposure in the darker parts of the scene. Now to be fair, these were cherry-picked scenes which really showcases the Osmo 360's better dynamic range. In more evenly lit environments and scenes with a narrower lighting range, the HDR advantage has a much smaller impact. For context, DJI claims the Osmo 360 delivers 13.5 stops of dynamic range, whereas Insta360 advertises up to 13.5 stops, which is presumably only when active HDR is enabled, and that mode is only available at up to 5.7K resolution. Now some people will inevitably mention Insta360's new adaptive tone mode, but my last 2 videos were actually dedicated to testing this mode out, and the bottom line is that it can't replace true dynamic range. It often ended up just shifting the problem, trading blown out highlights for crushed shadows, and on top of that it can introduce jello effects and other unwanted motion artifacts. So while it can help, it doesn't bring the X5 anywhere close to the level of the Osmo 360. Another big advantage of the Osmo 360 is its ability to capture more detail natively without leaning so heavily on AI image processing to make the footage look good. This was something that always bothered me with the Insta360 X5. When you zoom in on things like road textures, they often look overly synthetic because they seem to be run through an AI upscaling algorithm. To show you what I mean, I ran a simple test capturing 2 of my houseplants, keeping the cameras at the same distance. On the X5, the pre-export footage looked low-res and full of jagged edges. Once exported though, it looked much cleaner, but that's because of aggressive upscaling and post-processing, not really because the raw capture was high quality. The Osmo 360 tells a different story, it looks sharper straight out of the camera, and the difference compared to the exported footage isn't as big. When you compare the final exports side by side, the difference is clear. The Osmo 360's footage looks more natural and more true to life. Meanwhile, the X5 has that overly smoothed, processed feel. So while the X5 can look as clean as the Osmo 360, a lot of it is coming from AI magic. While watching Osmo 360 versus Insta360 X5 comparisons, one video that stood out to me was this one by Hugh Ho. He pointed out something interesting, which is that using cheap, replaceable lenses might come at the cost of lower quality glass or weaker anti-reflective coatings, which can lead to more lens flare. And sure enough, I noticed this in my own testing. Compared to the Osmo 360, the X5 showed more veiling flare that stretched across the image, along with some noticeable flare specks. Now to be clear, I don't think improved flare resistance is enough to outweigh the huge advantage of having replaceable lenses, especially in action-heavy use where lenses are more likely to get scratched or damaged. But still, it's a nice little silver lining if you're disappointed about the Osmo 360's fixed lens design. At least you're getting cleaner, more controlled optics in return. Now while the Osmo 360 also has the edge when it comes to 10-bit color, I haven't had time to explore that yet, so the last big advantage I want to mention is its ability to shoot 8K at 50 frames per second. This might not sound like a huge deal if you're not exporting at 50 FPS, but it actually gives you a lot more flexibility in post. On a 30 FPS timeline, I can slow that 50p footage down by 40%, which gives you those smooth, dreamy, cinematic shots without sacrificing resolution. Meanwhile, on the Insta360 X5, 8K is capped at 30 FPS. Trying to slow that footage down, you end up with choppy playback that looks very bad. Now that I've covered the four major advantages, I want to talk about one area where the Insta360 X5 is clearly ahead of the DJI Osmo 360, and that's lens distortion. I actually discovered this while trying to match footage for this very video. When I lined up similar framing, the X5 had a much more natural look. Straight lines stayed straight, whereas the Osmo 360 introduced a noticeably stronger fisheye effect, making things look warped. To check this more precisely, I set both cameras up in the exact same spot in my room and compared them at similar FOV settings. As you can see, when I go for a comparable wide angle, the Osmo 360's distortion is far more pronounced. Now DJI Studio does let you adjust the field of view and apply lens correction, but no matter how much I tweaked these settings, I couldn't get it looking anywhere near as good as I could with the Insta360 X5. So why is this the case? Well, Insta360 has been in the 360 game longer, so they've had more time to optimize their correction algorithms. But it could also come down to hardware differences. The Osmo 360 uses a larger square sensor and its own lens design, which may inherently introduce more curvature at edges. Either way, this is a pretty big deal for me because I don't like that warped look, and the X5 lets you zoom out further before the edge warping becomes too much. I'll definitely be testing this out further and making a dedicated video on the issue soon. So overall, the DJI Osmo 360 genuinely surprised me with some clear wins in image quality over the Insta360 X5. I also personally prefer its color science, especially since it matches better with my Pocket 3 and Osmo Action 5 footage. That said, the noticeable warping at wider FOV settings on the Osmo 360 is still nagging at me. I can't help but wonder if it's something that could be improved with software updates, or if it's just a limitation of the hardware. Warping like that is one of the easiest ways to tell something was shot with a 360 camera, and that can really break the immersion when mixed into footage from other cameras. Now, just to be clear, the video was focused solely on video quality, but there's a lot more to consider when choosing a 360 camera. The Insta360 X5 feels more mature overall, with a more intuitive and fully featured editing app, as well as a broader accessory ecosystem. In contrast, the Osmo 360 still feels new and rough around the edges, so for now I'm holding on to both cameras.